The year is 1946. The place is Gorizia, a small scarred city straddling the nascent border between Italy and a new communist Yugoslavia. The scent of rain-soaked concrete and burnt gunpowder still hangs in the autumn air. It is not the triumphant, celebratory peace promised by newsreels in London or New York. It is a silence heavy with suspicion, a peace fractured by the echo of unseen gunfire. The great global war, the war against Hitler, is officially over. But here, on the edges of what was once the Italian nation, a different, more terrifying conflict is just beginning. A war of memory, of reprisal, and of silence. The world remembers the great Axis surrender of 1945. They remember the triumph of the Allies in Berlin, the mushroom cloud over Japan. But few remember the moment Italy truly broke. Not in 1943, when Mussolini was deposed, but in the years that followed, when the Italian nation became not merely a defeated enemy, but a battlefield, a prize, and finally, a ghost. This is the central irony, the historical contradiction that has been deliberately scrubbed from the official narrative. For 2 years, from the dramatic armistice of Cassibile in September 1943 until the final collapse in 1945, Italy suffered a unique trauma. They were fighting the Allies, then fighting alongside the Allies, while simultaneously fighting a brutal ideological civil war against themselves. The nation was ripped in half, a fascist puppet state in the north, the German-occupied Repubblica Sociale Italiana, RSI, and a co-belligerent kingdom in the south, struggling to prove its worth to its former enemies. What they didn't know then, what the strategists in Washington and the commanders in the field failed to grasp, was that the Italian struggle was not merely a transition from enemy to friend. It was a descent into a geopolitical abyss, where the lines between partisan, patriot, collaborator, and criminal became hopelessly blurred. And the cost of this confusion, the price of this split identity, would be paid not on the grand battlefields, but in the quiet, desolate corners of their own land. In the summer of 1943, the sound of the deep-throated roar of the Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, was initially greeted in the south with a desperate, disbelieving hope. The myth of Mussolini's empire had evaporated like morning mist, but that hope quickly turned to ash. As the Germans, Italy's supposed allies, reacted with swift, cold fury to the armistice, disarming their former comrades in arms, the true nature of the country's fate was revealed. The famed historian Claudio Pavone described this period as 3 simultaneous wars: the patriotic war against the foreign German occupier, the civil war between fascists and anti-fascists, and the class war, fought by many partisans for a revolutionary future. This cocktail of conflict created an environment of unimaginable cruelty and complexity. While the Allies pushed slowly up the peninsula, bogged down by the brutal terrain and the tenacity of the German Wehrmacht, a shadow war was raging in the hills and cities. The orders were simple: clear the road to Rome. But every village we took, every bridge we secured felt tainted. The locals weren't just happy to see us, they were terrified of the fascists in the next valley, who were terrified of the partisans in the hills above them. It was a snake pit. We were fighting the Germans, but the Italians were fighting for their very souls. The scale of the technological shift was staggering. Once a proud naval power, the surviving Italian fleet was now serving Allied convoys, its battleships reduced to escort duties. The industrial heartland of the North, still under RSI and German control, continued to churn out fighter aircraft like the Machi C-205 and the Fiat G. But these were now fighting against the majority of their own countrymen, and against the crushing industrial might of the US Air Force. It was this chaotic duality that allowed the true post-war tragedy to be dismissed. The strategic focus was Germany. Italy, having changed sides, was downgraded from an enemy to a problem, a logistical headache, a political quagmire. And in this bureaucratic and strategic downgrading, the profound human suffering of its people, the victims of German reprisals, the victims of civil war executions, and the victims of the coming political purges, was silently and systematically overlooked. The war ended for Italy in April 1945 with the execution of Mussolini and the final German surrender, but the violence did not. The real story, the mystery of the missing thousands, The geopolitical cover-up and the long, painful erasure of a nation's tragedy had only just begun. It is a story not of grand battles, but of whispers, disappearances, and a peace that felt more like a continuation of the war by other means. The question is not simply how Italy was defeated. The question is, what happened to the defeated victors? The answer lies buried beneath layers of political expediency and intentional silence. Stay with us as we unearth the secrets of the unfinished Italian war. If these forgotten histories intrigue you, if you believe the truth deserves to be remembered, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We've only just begun to scratch the surface. The date is September 9th, 1943. The location is an airfield near Rome. The air crackles not with the static of radio transmission, but with the sudden, cold dread of betrayal. News has just broken. The Italian government has signed an armistice with the Allies. But the announcement, vague and hesitant, provided no explicit instruction on what Italian units were to do about the Germans, their erstwhile allies, now embedded in every major position. The German response was immediate, ruthless, and entirely expected by Hitler's generals. This was the moment the Italian state was strategically atomized. Operation Axis, was Hitler's contingency plan to disarm the entire Italian military machine, seizing their heavy weaponry, their supply depots, and their personnel. Across Europe, nearly 1 million Italian soldiers, stationed from the Balkans to France, suddenly found themselves staring down the barrels of German rifles. The magnificent Italian navy, the Regia Marina, once a symbol of fascist ambition, received the order to sail to Allied-controlled ports. For the sailors, the deep churning sound of the engines on that desperate voyage, heading toward their former enemies to surrender, must have sounded like the grinding gears of a national funeral. Many refused, scuttling their own ships or turning them toward German-held ports. The statistics of this strategic catastrophe are numbing. Within weeks, approximately 800,000 Italian soldiers were captured by the Germans. About 200,000 chose to join the German-controlled fascist forces of the RSI. A few thousand managed to join the Allied-aligned Esercito Corbelligerante Italiano, ICF. The vast remainder, over 500,000 men, refused to swear allegiance to Hitler or Mussolini's puppet regime. These men were designated Internati Militari Italiani, IMI, stripped of their prisoner-of-war status to avoid Geneva Convention protections, and shipped to labor camps in Germany. They were not just prisoners, they were strategic and moral ghosts. The Italian soldier is not cowardly, he is poorly led and politically weak. When they signed the armistice, they signed their own death warrant as a strategic entity. The disarming was brutally efficient. We simply treated them as the unreliable, feckless people they always were, useful only for labor and internal security. While the official military crumpled, a new technologically primitive but ideologically potent force arose in the hills, the partisans. These were not the uniformed armies of tradition. They were teachers, peasants, former industrial workers, and crucially ex-soldiers who had escaped the German sweep. Their technology was desperation. Captured German rifles, Mauser Kar 98K, the occasional British-supplied Sten submachine gun dropped from the air, and, most effectively, their intimate knowledge of the terrain. The partisan war was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, a concept that terrified the occupying Germans and their RSI counterparts. They targeted supply lines, rail networks, and individual officers. Their strength lay in their ability to vanish, melting back into the civilian population after an ambush. This created a climate of indiscriminate German retaliation. The Germans responded with a counter-insurgency doctrine called Bandenbekämpfung, bandit fighting. For every German or RSI soldier killed, 10 Italian civilians were executed. The use of armored cars and motorcycle patrols, nimble, fast units that could quickly enter and exit villages, became the tactical signature of this terror campaign. The psychological impact of this policy, turning every civilian into a potential victim, effectively transformed the entire Italian population into a hostage. The partisan movement, despite its internal political divisions, communists, socialists, monarchists, grew into a formidable machine. By 1944, their ranks swelled to an estimated 250,000 fighters. They were not simply holding ground, they were creating a second front behind the German lines, tying up critical divisions that should have been fighting the Allies on the Gothic line. We were freezing, we were starving, but we were free. When you see a young fascist boy, barely 17, looking at you through a telescopic sight, you realize the war isn't just German versus American. It is brother versus brother. The hardest thing was not the German 80mm fire. It was looking into the eyes of a man who spoke your dialect and pulling the trigger. The partisans were the first true victors of the Italian Civil War, liberating cities like Genoa and Milan before the Allies arrived. Their triumph was absolute, but their victory was short-lived. The Allies, needing stability for the emerging Cold War, were deeply suspicious of the predominantly communist-led partisan brigades. The moment the German threat was gone, the Allied command, through the oversight of the Allied Military Government of Occupied Territories, WWII, moved swiftly to disarm the partisans. The heroes of the resistance, the men and women who had fought the Civil War against fascism, were suddenly told to hand over their weapons, their political power, and their revolutionary ambition. The great betrayal was complete, first by their German allies, then by their own government, and finally by the Western powers. The climax of any war is supposed to bring clarity. The good guys win, the bad guys lose, and justice is delivered. But in the Julian March, the northeastern region of Italy encompassing Istria, Trieste, and Dalmatia, the end of the war was merely the beginning of a terrifying new chapter, a brutal ideological purge that remains the single most suppressed tragedy in the history of post-war Europe, the Foibe massacres and the Julian-Dalmatian exodus. The Foibe are deep, natural chasms, geological sinkholes common in the karst terrain of the region. They were beautiful, natural formations that, in the spring of 1945, became silent, yawning graves. The terror in Trieste was not delivered by tanks or bombs, but by silence. As Marshal Tito's communist Yugoslav forces swept into the territory, ostensibly chasing the retreating Germans, they also began a systematic campaign of elimination against Italian civilians, administrators, priests, landowners, and anyone deemed an enemy of the people. The sound that struck the deepest terror was not the shout of an execution squad, but the measured tread of boots on cobblestone in the middle of the night, followed by a sudden, violent knock. The victims were bound, often tortured, and driven out into the desolate countryside. They were executed, sometimes with a single shot, sometimes tied to others who were shot first, dragging the living into the darkness. The earth itself seemed to swallow them whole. The exact number remains fiercely contested, a testament to the decades of deliberate silence, but estimates suggest between 5,000 and 20,000 Italian civilians and soldiers were killed in this wave of violence, primarily between 1943 and 1947. These were not simply fascist reprisals. Many victims had no political affiliation, targeted only for being Italian, for representing the established administrative and cultural order that Tito's Yugoslavia intended to erase. The true scale of the tragedy, however, lies in the Esodo Istriano, the Julian-Dalmatian exodus. As the new Titoist regime solidified its claim on the territory, implementing forced nationalization and political persecution, a mass migration began. Hundreds of thousands of Italians, from laborers to intellectuals, from fishermen to engineers, decided that staying meant certain ruin or death. Perspective. An Esul, Exodus refugee, 1947. We left with one suitcase, one single suitcase. My father had built that house with his own hands over 30 years. He looked back from the railway platform, and he didn't weep, he just looked empty. We were told by the authorities when we reached mainland Italy that we were a difficult problem. We were not victims of the war. We were treated like an inconvenient political stain that needed to be cleaned up quickly. Over the next decade, between 250,000 and 350,000 Italians fled their ancestral lands. This was not a military retreat. It was one of the largest forced migrations of a European population in the post-war era. They abandoned homes, businesses, and centuries of culture. The mystery is why this monumental tragedy, 250,000 people stripped of their identity and forced to flee, was ignored by the victorious Western Allies. The answer is pure, unadulterated Cold War strategy. Yugoslavia, though communist, had broken from Stalin's Soviet orbit. Tito was a valuable maverick asset that the West desperately needed to keep as a buffer against the Red Army. To officially acknowledge and condemn the atrocities committed by Tito's forces against the Italians, a Western-aligned power, would have destabilized the Tito regime, potentially driving Yugoslavia back into the Soviet bloc. The price of geopolitical stability was the systematic denial of Italian suffering. The Italian refugees were not just forgotten, they were strategically silenced. In the Treaty of Paris of 1947, the former Italian territories of Istria and Dalmatia were formally ceded to Yugoslavia. Italy, a co-belligerent that had fought alongside the Allies since 1943, was treated as a defeated, disgraced enemy. They lost territory, paid massive reparations, and were internationally forbidden to maintain a powerful military, all while their former countrymen were being persecuted and expelled. The silence was the final act of violence. The fate of the Asuli became a political hot potato in the newly formed Italian Republic, ignored by the left, who did not want to alienate communist regimes, and often exploited by the right. The true story of the Foibe and the Exodus was relegated to the dusty archives of provincial history, deemed too complicated, too dangerous, and too inconvenient to the smooth narrative of Allied victory. The strategic landscape of post-war Italy was a field of psychological and political landmines. The country that emerged from the rubble of 1945 was strategically weak, economically crippled, and politically polarized to an extreme not seen in Western Europe. The true legacy of the Civil War was not just the physical destruction, but the deep-seated ideological scar tissue that shaped the next 50 years. The most potent strategic threat to the newly founded Italian Republic was not from a foreign power, but from its own people, or rather, a massive, highly organized political movement that was deeply suspicious of the Western powers, the Italian Communist Party, PCI. The PCI transformed from an underground resistance force, the backbone of many partisan brigades, into the largest communist party in any Western democracy. They carried the moral legitimacy of the anti-fascist struggle, making them virtually untouchable. Their strength was born directly from the war, from the common struggle against the Germans and the RSI. The Allied powers, primarily the United States, viewed this with mounting alarm. Italy, with its long coastline and strategic location in the Mediterranean, was too important to lose to the communist sphere. This strategic necessity meant that economic aid and political maneuvering took precedence over true national reconciliation or investigation into past atrocities. The Marshall Plan funds, starting in 1948, became the ultimate tool of strategic control. Italy received massive injections of capital aimed at rebuilding its infrastructure and, critically, at propping up the centrist, pro-Western Christian Democrat Party. The unspoken contract was clear: economic salvation in exchange for unquestioning alignment with the US and NATO. The 1948 Italian general election became the definitive climax of this strategic conflict. It was less a democratic vote and more a Cold War proxy battle fought with Vatican influence, CIA black propaganda, and the looming threat of cutting off American aid if the communist-led Popular Front won. Perspective, CIA official, 1948, based on declassified documents. Our objective in Italy was simple: keep the Reds out of power, whatever the cost. We had witnessed the chaos of the Civil War. We knew the organizational strength of the PCI. Italy was the first domino. We poured funds, propaganda, and subtle coercion into that election. The moral ambiguity of what happened in Istria, the political confusion, all of it was secondary to the strategic imperative of securing the Mediterranean. The partisan legacy, which should have been a source of national unity, became a symbol of national division. The historical irony was that the communist partisans, the bravest fighters against the Nazis and fascists, were now cast by the West as the greatest threat to Italian democracy. The war's industrial legacy was devastation. Italy's railway network was in ruins. Steel production was crippled. The ability of the country to rebuild was hampered not only by physical damage, but by the harsh terms of the 1947 Treaty of Paris. Italy was forbidden from developing and owning certain types of modern military technology, severely limiting its strategic sovereignty. The naval base at Taranto, once a symbol of Regia Marina power, was a ghost of its former self, its docks scarred, its best vessels now owned by foreign powers as reparations. The experience of the Internati Militari Italiani, IMI, the soldiers who refused to serve Hitler and were held as slave labor, further poisoned the strategic well. When they finally returned home, they were neither heroes nor recognized POWs. Their sacrifices were politically inconvenient to a nation struggling to bury its fascist past and focus on the future. Their sheer numbers, over 500,000 men, represented a national trauma that the state failed to address for decades. The strategic scars of the Italian War were therefore twofold: physical destruction and a profound forced strategic dependence on the United States. The peace was not earned, it was bought, and the price was the erasure of the national narrative of suffering, particularly the uncomfortable truths of the foibe and the Civil War violence that lingered after the formal German surrender. Italy had secured its democracy, but at the cost of its full historical memory. The Italian experience after 1945 was not a triumphant healing, but a long, complex repression. The final act of the story is the legacy of the ghost nation, a country whose history was officially sanitized to fit the Western Cold War agenda. The great narrative lie imposed upon Italy was one of simple transition. Fascism was defeated, democracy arrived, and the nation was quickly back on its feet. The messy, brutal details of the Civil War, the mass expulsions, the summary executions, and the sheer magnitude of unacknowledged suffering were swept into a zone of silence. The true climax of this forgotten war was not a battle, but a struggle for historical recognition. For decades, the tragedy of the Foibe and the Esodo was fiercely debated and often denied. It was the subject of intense political football, with the left refusing to condemn the Yugoslav perpetrators and the right accused of exploiting the victims. The silence held firm for half a century. It wasn't until the 1990s, with the collapse of the communist regimes and the end of the Cold War, that the geopolitical need for that silence evaporated. Only then, with the passing of Law 92/2004, which established a national memorial day for the Foibe exiles, did the Italian Republic finally, officially, acknowledge the profound moral trauma of its forgotten victims. The human and psychological cost remains staggering. The Asuli, the refugees from Istria and Dalmatia, spent their lives in temporary camps, campi profughi, often treated with suspicion by their own countrymen who viewed them as a burden or, worse, as residual fascists. The trauma of forced displacement and loss of identity became generational. The legacy of the war in Italy is one of fundamental, irreconcilable paradoxes. 1. The defeated victor. Italy fought as a major Axis power, yet contributed significantly to the Allied victory as a co-belligerent. It was simultaneously a defeated enemy and a founder member of NATO. This duality has hampered its ability to forge a single, cohesive national memory of the war. 2. The technological paradox. The country's post-war reconstruction, the so-called miracolo economico, was a triumph of engineering and industrial will. Yet its advanced military technology and strategic independence were intentionally stunted by the Allies, ensuring Italy could never again pose a major threat. 3. The silence. The historical focus was successfully maintained on German crimes, the Holocaust, the destruction of Europe, while the ideological terror and mass expulsions on the Adriatic frontier were intentionally minimized to preserve a strategic alliance. What they didn't know in the triumphalist days of 1945, the policymakers in London and Washington, and the generals celebrating victory, was that by strategically silencing the Italian tragedy, they were sowing the seeds of historical division for decades to come. The goal was to secure the peace, but the method was to suppress the truth. The story of the Italians after WWII is the story of a nation that paid twice for its allegiances, once for starting the war and again for helping to end it. They were subjected to a civil war, a brutal German occupation, mass expulsions by their former neighbors, and finally, historical erasure by their new allies. The sound of the silence that followed the Foibe massacres, the unspoken trauma of the thousands of refugees, is the final deep thrum of the unfinished Italian war. It is a history that insists on being heard, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. The truth of what really happened to the Italians after WWII is the uncomfortable reality that victory does not always bring justice, and peace often requires the convenient sacrifice of history. The scars of this forgotten war are still visible on the face of modern Italy. If you believe that the complexity of history and the truth of these forgotten victims deserves to be acknowledged, then join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to ensure you never miss an episode that challenges the conventional narrative. Thank you for watching and for helping us keep these crucial histories alive.